Thank you, thanks.
And thanks for staying. I know documentation is always the important topic, but no one ever stays for the talk. So, so thanks for staying. So I am not a part of this community at all. I have heard of Umbraco for reasons that will become clear in a minute, but I don't really know very much about it. So I would kind of like to get to know each other a little bit first. Who are developers in the room? All right, okay. Who identifies as a documentation writer? Okay, cool. Okay, this is the right crowd. This is good. And does anyone work in like support maybe as well? No? Maybe marketing? Okay. And when it comes to documentation, what languages are people using? English? Okay. Danish? All right. German? French? The people who didn't put their hand up, what language are you writing in? I don't know. There are others, of course. And I'm guessing in terms of programming languages, mostly C# and probably JavaScript as well. Okay. So a little bit about me. I was born in London, but I have not actually lived there for a very long time. And then I lived, I'm not quite sure why I have an animation on that, but anyway. Then I lived in Melbourne in Australia for a long time, which explains my weird hybrid accent. But for the past couple of years, I've been living in the People's Republic of Berlin. So actually, I also spend a lot of my time working with non-native English speakers. So I have quite a big section in the second half of this presentation around kind of quick, easy tips for getting better technical English. And a lot of those have come from working with non-native speakers as well. Not just German. I work with a lot of people from Russian-speaking countries, Slavic-speaking countries. Slavic isn't a language, but Slavic-style languages, etc. And I basically run my own business. This is some of the companies I've worked for. I tried to pick ones you may know. Like some are kind of content related, some are C# projects, some are just kind of known. But it's not all of them, and I do a mixture of documentation, technical blogs, videos, books, a whole bunch of things. But actually where I started in documentation, and this is where I may get kicked out of the conference, was with this project. So my first ever documentation contributions were to Drupal 7, another CMS that went through a long transition between 7 and 8, and although Drupal took a very long time. If you ever followed at some point an iteration of the Drupal 7 Getting Started guide, I did that in a hackathon at one point, and this is where I kind of realized I did a computer science degree, I was a programmer implementing PHP CMSs for a very long time, and then realized I was better actually at explaining things than coding. I can read code, I can write code, but I was actually better at explaining it and kind of getting involved in hackathons and things. I suddenly realized there's actually a job I could do as well. So that's basically where I started, and I've been doing it full-time for maybe 5-6 years, working for a lot of different companies. So let's get into the meat of the talk. I guess I'm asking a leading question here. What's one of the first things you tend to look at with a new project? Hey, someone's in the right talk. And I'm going to use the term project kind of loosely here because there are commercial tools, there are open source tools, etc. It's just a kind of easier way to refer to a bunch of different things together. And I'm going to kick off with a couple of quotes here in a minute. But yeah, quite often you will look at the documentation first to understand, is this something I want to use? What does it do? Does it meet my use case? Etc., etc. And based on your experience with that, you may kind of think, this isn't for me, this is for me, I've got no idea what this is, which is probably quite often the actual response, etc., etc. There's a great quote from the creator of Perl, saying, documentation is complete when someone can use your project without having to look at its code. And as a big room of developers, when was the last time that happened to you? Yeah, it doesn't happen that often, does it, unfortunately? Unless it's a fully SaaS project when you have no real choice. You can't look at the code. So most of the time we're trying to fill this gap. And there are some developer projects. I mostly work on developer tools. There are obviously projects aimed at end users that ideally cut out documentation. And a lot of operating systems and GUI applications these days have got better and better at not having documentation anymore and becoming more intuitive. In the days when you used to buy a Mac and you would have a manual like this, you don't really get that anymore. In fact, when was the last time you even really looked at help in Mac OS or Windows? You don't really do it anymore, but that was kind of the way that everything used to be documented. But developer tools are different. We need references and things like that. But I also know that documentation is a chore for many people. In fact, something I take issue with is the Angular style guide says whenever you commit documentation, you label it chore. And chore in English is something you don't want to do, which I take quite offense to. But that's kind of what this talk is about. I understand that it's something that developers often kind of have to do or hopefully want to do, but it's not always the easiest thing to do for various reasons, and I kind of want to give a bunch of fairly easy to follow tips that will hopefully help you write that easier and end up with something hopefully better as well. So when I was asked to do this talk, I was said, can you involve Umbraco somehow? Firstly, I thought, I'd see if you can use Umbraco for documentation. And one of the documentation team of Umbraco said, no, don't do that. So I stopped on that idea, and I thought I would look at the documentation instead and use that as kind of the basis of the talk. Documentation is one of these things that it's very hard sometimes to give kind of vague general advice because everything is quite specific, especially with a tool like a content management system where it's multi-purpose and people use it for lots of different things. How can you suit everybody? And you can't suit everybody. And this is often reflected in projects like this. You'll get lots of complaints because people have a very specific thing they're trying to solve. And of course, you're not going to give them a very specific answer because there's 100 other very specific questions also without a very specific answer. So it is quite challenging. So I thought I would work with it because it's obviously something you all know way better than me. So I'm probably going to make some mistakes here. But whilst I was looking around, and I'm very pleased to be here, but I'm going to get a little bit personal now. So I found some of these things from 2017. This was 2 years ago. I don't know if things are better, I'm not sure. I wasn't there in 2017, but a quote like this, and also another longer quote like this. So, and to be honest with you, as I say, I have to be fair here, you will find similar comments in many technical projects. This is not something the Umbraco community needs to be ashamed of. Like, you will get the same quotes everywhere. And I'm pretty sure even documentation I've worked on, people will say the same thing because it's hard to make everybody happy. So I guess the first question, the first thing to say is don't panic. I'm going to dive into the Umbraco documentation and maybe make a few bits of live editing, and maybe some people might take that as criticism, but I really don't want it to be. It's just me kind of using something to work on. And tech writers, like developers, we do have our own kind of unwritten rule that we don't always criticize what people have done before, because you never really know what resources were available, what decisions were made, etc., etc. So I don't want it to be taken as a criticism, I'm just using it as an example. And none of us are perfect, of course, and we all have constraints on our time. So feeding into what I said about documentation not always being something people want to do, this is a quote I had from a random person I met from Wikimedia once. I don't expect you to know this person, but it was a good quote, and I've used it ever since. And this is a lot of what this talk is about. I'm also going to share some tools and things like that that will help you. I'm going to give you a lot of advice, and you'll think, my God, I can't remember all this. And then at the end, I'm going to show you some tools that will help you with a lot of this. And that's a thing developers like, tooling. So don't worry. So first, why even write documentation in the first place? The very simple question would be probably because we need it most of the time, but let's break that down a little bit more. I have the 3 W's. I've sort of rather tenuously shoved my lines here into fit 3 doubles, where maybe they're not the ideal, but we'll go with it. So, who are you writing for? What are they trying to achieve? And why are you writing this? Some of these may seem a little similar, and a lot of these questions are hopefully answered by product people at some point too. But you can ask them again when you get further down the line into documentation. So, and I'm going to get to some specifics to Umbraco as far as I could kind of tell in a minute, but there are often multiple people you might be writing for at different levels of an experience. Getting started, someone who is a more advanced user, they have different requirements. They're going to be trying to achieve different things. One person might want to just install and get started. One person might be writing an extension. And then why are you writing this? This is interesting, especially with product companies, because sometimes there may be other reasons for writing content as well. It may not be always just because you want to fill a gap. It might be because you have something to sell, a feature to announce, etc., etc. So there's often multiple reasons. And in all of these different cases, you might have a slightly different way of writing, a slightly different audience. A blog post, for example, is going to be very different from API documentation, even though you may be the one person writing all of these. So I kind of did a very brief survey myself based on next to no knowledge of Umbraco, but just my knowledge of CMSs. So I'm guessing these are some of the main users. We have content writers and editors who want to know how to write and find content. And why are they doing that? It's because they want to create content, of course. They're probably going to need fairly visual documentation. Maybe the interface itself does a lot of self-documenting with tooltips, walkthroughs, and things like that. And they're not necessarily technical. So they have a very specific need. Then you'll have administrators and editors, the people who configure the site and manage the site. They'll be using that same interface, but they'll maybe see more of it. They need to know where they can create things, where they can set things up. Maybe they'll be putting a bit of code in, and you want to encourage them to do things the best way to make it easier for the content writers and editors. And then finally, we have the implementers and extenders, mostly probably developers, people setting up sites, people building extensions and plugins for the site, and they'll want reference code, SDKs, APIs, etc., etc. And you're doing that because you want to build an ecosystem. A product or a project like Umbraco exists quite often because of third-party implementers and extenders, and a lot of more kind of, or less open SaaS companies, that's how they live. They basically create kind of intentional gaps, so the third-party ecosystem fills them, and there's revenue coming through for everybody. So these are kind of some of the people I had a look at, and in these cases, say for the first people, we might want to have maybe more videos, might be more useful. Whereas the bottom one, we probably want more code examples and things like that. And the one in the middle, somewhere in the middle. So, my first big tip is assume nothing, most of the time. Because as developers, we actually often have a tendency to think that the way we do something, the way we have our machine set up, the dependencies we have installed is normal. Surely everyone has that installed. Probably not. So I would highly recommend that whenever you create tutorials, for example, you test on vanilla machines each time, virtual machines, Docker images, whatever it may be to get a vanilla machine. Do not always assume that everyone will have Node installed, for example, or a particular package. Umbraco is a C# code base. C# is a language a lot of developers like, but it's not necessarily one that's used by a large group of people. It has its own paradigms and tooling that will also be unfamiliar to a lot of people who don't come from that world. And I actually am working on a C# project elsewhere, and I'm still learning how it works and how it understands and how a lot of the tooling fits together. And Microsoft does a very good job of building that tooling, but it's still quite unknown to me. I'm still figuring it out. Things like NuGet or Nugget, I don't even know how to pronounce it. Things like that are still quite, take some getting used to. Things like Mono versus .NET Core. As a newbie to this space, I don't really understand the history. I don't really know what that means. Why is one different from the other? What's going on there? Do I need Windows? Can I use a Mac and Linux? I don't know. There's a lot of assumptions there that you may make, and someone kind of new to the space may not know. And I think the same goes to a more theoretical level as well, not just a technical level. A lot of developers now, especially, are coming from boot camps, coding boot camps. They haven't necessarily done a computer science degree where you learn things like software patterns and best practices. And there's a lot of, and I'm not, actually there's a whole other conversation about whether that's good or bad, but again, you cannot assume that everyone reading a developer documentation had the same education as you, the same background as you. And this sounds like a lot of work. And it is a lot of work, but in the long run, hopefully it results in something better for everyone to use. And one of the things I will recommend is, I guess the only thing you're going to spend here is time. Getting rid of assumptions takes time, but there's no harm in doing it. If at the beginning of your getting started guide you say, hey, are you new to C#? Here's a great resource here. You don't have to write it all, because that is very hard to maintain, but you can link out to resources that can get people started if they're a few steps behind where you think they need to be. And then you need to refine your concepts. So I'm a big believer in thinking that anything, any project, no matter how technical, you can refine it into something like, I don't know if you're familiar with the term, an elevator pitch. It's a term taken out of a startup world where you're stuck in a lift, as we will say in British English instead, an elevator for 3 minutes with a VC, and you've got to convince them that your idea is amazing. And this is quite hard. Writing things short and concise is hard. But I do think anything, no matter how technical you think it is, can be reduced to that. And this really helps you start to understand what you're doing and why it's useful to somebody. And of course, you're going to abstract a lot of detail. That's fine. The people who want to know that detail can find it elsewhere later. But to begin with, someone can find that pitch and say, this is for me, I want to know more. Oh no, this isn't what I was looking for. I'm good. They don't need to waste a lot of time trawling through long pages after page to find out it's not really what they thought it was. And this is hard. And I will say that not everyone is necessarily very good at distilling complex projects into this kind of terminology. And that's fine. Some of us are good writers, some of us are good programmers, but hopefully you're in a team where you can find people to help with this, and that's good. Now, a content management system, continuing to use Umbraco as an example, is actually relatively easy in this way. A lot of people now are familiar with what a content management system is, whether they've used a very simple one or a very complex one. A lot of people have used one now. So if you tell people it's a platform for managing and creating content, a lot of people will understand that now. But I guess where we start to get more difficult here is trying to identify what the difference between Umbraco and other CMSs might be. And maybe that one is harder to refine. So I've seen a lot here, Umbraco refers to itself as the friendly CMS, as its kind of differentiator. And that obviously means something, but what does it actually mean? What does friendly mean? How do you refine and explain what friendly means? Who knows? And the problem with using a word like friendly is if someone gets into difficulty, they will then find a term like friendly to be really kind of patronizing because it's like, well, I got stuck, it's not very friendly at all. And there's some interesting talks on this actually. I saw a very good talk with someone from Atlassian a couple of years ago when they talked about, in their documentation, they define a level of wink, like a kind of level of humor to use. For example, if you're getting someone started, then maybe you can afford to be more friendly and more cheeky and more kind of fun. If someone is drilling down into very complex API documentation, maybe that's not the right place. Or if they're getting an error message. I mean, we've all experienced the kind of silly error messages, and sometimes when you've been struggling for 2 hours, that's the last thing you want to see. You want an error message just to tell you what on earth is going on, not make a joke. So getting this level of friendliness and wink can be quite difficult. So we start to get a little interesting here to start to think, what does it actually mean? What is it about Umbraco that separates it from other CMSs. And now we could also include things like static site generators and content API frameworks as well. I don't know, does anyone have a term that they could think that, aside from friendly, makes Umbraco different from other CMSs you could use? This is where I figure out if I can actually hear people. Any ideas? Flexible, okay. See, that's an interesting one as well, because that is a good thing that people will understand, but documenting flexible is also a challenge, because flexible means you can do anything. How do you document you can do anything? That's actually quite difficult too. So you start to see it gets a lot harder than you might think so, to refine these concepts. But we could start very simple, and as we get further down, it starts to get more challenging. And I guess a lot of this will involve talking to customers, talking to support. When you are writing documentation, support and people like developer relations, people who engage with customers and users can be your best friends, because they will tell you what people are doing, where they get stuck, the problems they encounter, what they're trying to do, common use cases and things like that. So even if you have a system that is flexible, at least you start to narrow down what it is people are doing and the common use cases, and stick to maybe using those in your documentation, because you know that's what people are doing, as opposed to something else maybe they're not doing. Next comes structure. We know what we need to write. How do we structure it? What's a good way to do it? Now, firstly, let's have a look at different sorts of documentation types. And the terms that, that tech writers or documentarians, as sometimes we call ourselves, like to use for these varies. Of course, we're still vaguely technical people. We all like to have constant arguments about terminology. But these will be things like getting started. This is the age-old 101, get started, onboarding, someone's new, how do they get started with something? Then from then on, we'll have things like guides, specific getting started guides around specific areas of a project. Then we might have reference. This is APIs, SDKs, things like that. These can sometimes be auto-generated, and we'll come to that in a minute, because you can generally assume this is when people are like, I'm looking for a hammer, I want to know what a hammer does. A guide is what tells you what to do with that hammer. There's kind of a big difference there. And then explanation. This is not always relevant in every project, but this is sometimes more theoretical stuff. So I've actually been doing a reasonable amount of work recently in the Ethereum ecosystem, which is a weird ecosystem to work in. And there's a lot of this is a hard word to pronounce, explanation documentation. Let's just do that. Because there's a lot of cryptography underpinnings and consensus algorithms that people want to know about, but a developer doesn't necessarily need to know about to implement, but if they want to find that information, they can. And looking through the Umbraco documentation, I saw that it's mostly followed this pattern. There's getting started, there's implementation, extending, reference, tutorials, add-ons, cloud, and contribution documentation. How to actually contribute to the platform itself. So you will probably recognize a lot of these patterns. They might be called different things, but this is generally what you're going to need. And you may or may not need one or two of these depending on your project. Maybe you don't have an API, so you don't need reference documentation so much. And now we have things like onboarding and reading paths. So how do most people find documentation, do you think? Yeah. Search engine of choice, yes. So, you cannot assume that you create a great structure in your documentation and people are going to follow it. They won't. People will generally go to the big search bar in their browser and go, Umbraco, and then they'll end up at a page. So unfortunately, you cannot assume nothing, remember? So someone is looking for API for creating content type, for example, and they end up at that page. But then knowing how to use that API is obviously going to need a lot of other explanation that they're not necessarily going to find on that page because they haven't come through the paths. So you have to think about where in your structure could people appear and what do they need to know once they're there. And actually, I saw that Umbraco does this quite well. they've got this huge menu on the left with a lot of sub-items, but mostly collapse out in kind of a good structure, and that huge search box, which at least encourages people to use the internal search and hopefully kind of direct people more to what people are looking for as opposed to random search results from Google, which could refer to out-of-date versions and all sorts of things. The other thing is that hands up who has read documentation for a project from start to finish. One person, okay, well, I'm quite surprised. so documentation is not a book. People do not read it from start to finish. Actually, there is interesting research on this that some cultures do, but not in Europe, not European cultures. So people do not read from start to finish. So there's always this constant thinking about where are people in the experience, what do they need to know, etc., etc. So this does again mean common links back to things they need to know, etc., etc. And again, this is a lot of potential work, but there are ways that we can reduce some of this work, which we'll come to later. And as a SaaS-ish product, Umbraco has an advantage here with onboarding. I did go through the creating a site several times, and you have the opportunity to have things like walkthroughs and welcome bots, and I like the way that you can download your site as a local code base and things like that. There's lots of ways you can play with this, especially with developer tools, to get people started. I've got another section coming about that documentation isn't just words, but we'll come to that in a minute. Then we have the actual structure of the page itself. So firstly, we have one problem. People will come to our documentation from who knows where. So now we've written this amazing page that we want them to read. When was the last time you read a documentation page from top to bottom? I'm expecting this guy to say yes again, but anybody else? One person, okay. But what do most people do with pages these days? Yeah, you skim around, you scroll around, you're looking for things. So again, we've spent all this time writing this great document and no one's even reading it. So what are we going to do about that? And there are actually eye tracking experiments from the University of Potsdam, just outside Berlin, where they've analyzed eye tracking, and there's lots of patterns for this. But there are ways you can do this. You have to break up the structure. You have the text that will tell you kind of the things you need to know, but you need to break it up with good structure. This is things like proper use of headings, using images, using code snippets, etc. And this means that people's eyes, as they skim, are drawn to those blocks, and then they read around it. I have a good example I'm going to show. This is a relatively old one. This is from a site. This is like a developer blog site. And actually, these sites can be some of the better ones to learn from because they're often ad-supported. And sites that are ad-supported have to work very hard to make sure people read their content. So they can be good ones to learn from. But let's see. This should hopefully play. No? Oh, there we go. So we'll see we have lots of headings, lots of pop-out boxes, formatting, code snippets, again, lots of headings. I don't think there's any images here, but there's quite a lot here that is breaking up your view as you scroll through. And this is quite long as well. Things jump out at you as you skim through. Yeah, you get the idea. So when I was looking at the Umbraco documentation, I found the structure there is slightly strange. There's lots of kind of chunks that make you jump around quite a lot. This is sort of good and bad because each section is quite short and takes you to the next place you need to go, but scrolling around it, the structure is a little kind of odd to look at initially. I mean, I haven't really used it extensively to know if that works or not, but it looks a little different from something like this. And I'll come to what I think is going on there a little bit later. So this sort of page structure is also important. If you are writing in something like Markdown, then Markdown is actually almost created to help create structures like this, which we'll come to a little bit later. So it's relatively easy to make good structure if you think about it slightly. Next one is code examples. We all know that code examples are useful. That's actually what developers are often looking for when they're skimming. A bit of code you can copy and paste and try. So how do you come up with a good code example? This is a challenge in itself. So my first piece of recommendation would be consistent and build from there. Maybe pick, after you've spoken to support and developer relations teams, etc., and you've found use cases, let's say finance, for example, then if 70% of your customers are working in finance, how about we use a finance example? And we start simple in the Getting Started guide, and we build from there. We can use a consistent example all throughout the documentation that people are building upon. So people can, even if they're not working in finance, they'll kind of go, well, I get this example, now I can kind of see how this feature I'm reading about fits with that, and I can expand it to be thinking about my use case, and etc. But if you keep jumping around code examples, people are getting a bit kind of distracted from what it is they can do. And this is kind of what you're trying to demonstrate with something very flexible like Umbraco, is you want to show as best as possible what is possible, and hope that people will then look at that and go, okay, this example isn't relevant to me, but I see what it's doing, and I can now use it in mine and change it a bit. The next important point here is use realistic examples. If possible, if you're a tech writer who's not really a developer, then try to find a developer who will help you create these examples, or at least check them over to make sure that you're using best practices for the language, and it's not kind of like child's code. It's actually the kind of like proper code that a production developer can look at and say, this is using best practices for the language, this isn't doing anything kind of stupid or silly, this is proper code examples that I can look at, and the person who wrote this knew what they were doing, and I kind of respect the code example. This sounds weird, but often if it's too dumbed down, a developer will look at it and say, yeah, well, I kind of see what it's doing, but this isn't realistic code. And this includes best practices for the language. And again, there's lots of tools to help you with this. We'll come to this in a minute. Test the code. How many times have you followed a tutorial, run the code, and it doesn't work? Yep. I've put an asterisk on that because we're going to look at that later. Again, there are ways we can do this. We don't have to push examples that don't work. There are ways we can test this. All right, let's get into the real chunk here. Language. And yeah, personal opinion warning I've put here. So this is stuff that I have found works well. Some of it you may not agree with, that's fine. We're in a technical conference. I very much expect people to have different opinions. Some of it may seem strange as well. Some of it may not seem familiar. But they're things that I have found worked, and I kind of want to introduce you to them, and you can try them and see how you go. And a lot of these are also, I'm aiming definitely at people, since I've been here, I seem to have met nothing but English people, but I'm sure there's a few of you who aren't. so it may not be your first language, so I want to offer advice to help you polish that too, without having to have done an English grammar course. And I have got lots of follow-up blog posts around this if you want to kind of go into more. The first one is consistency again. Consistency in documentation. Everything we're trying to do here is to reduce this cognitive overload, as it's called, of people when they're trying to understand something. They're trying to understand a technical project. It's already hard enough. Giving them a jarring experience whilst they're reading every little thing makes it harder and makes it worse. So, for example, you should create probably a style guide. I'm not talking about creating like a Microsoft style guide that's this thick, or I don't think it's that thick, it's like that thick, but whatever. But just some basic terminology. Is it content type or node type? Pick one, stick with it. There's no wrong or right, but just pick one and stick with it. Is it framework or SDK? Pick one, stick with it. And whether it's wrong or right, well, no, it has to be right as well, of course, but stick with one and keep with that. And this also goes with things like crazy little things like spellings or brand names. How is it capitalized, etc., etc. All these little things jar people. And as they come across a different version, they'll think, well, which one is correct? So people start to not necessarily trust the documentation anymore. And this doesn't mean you have to write like a machine. You can still inject character here. And then we will come into this a little bit later, actually. It is possible to balance that consistency and a style guide with character, whether that be a company character, but also an individual character, especially in blog posts and things like that. Now, next one is where I'm going to get into an English grammar lesson. So I've got you just before lunch, so you're nice and awake. You're ready. So developers are often a little bit skeptical and with some of these things, but and whilst we're writing more user-focused approach, we have to sometimes be careful about. So I like to say we involve the reader, but sometimes if you do this too much, it can come across as a bit patronizing. So it's hard to get the balance right. I'm going to try to show you some examples here. This is basically a way of making it feel like someone reading is kind of involved in the process and you're talking to them. We're not telling stories here, but we can involve the person who's reading to make it feel like they're accomplishing something. So I'm going to break this down a little bit. Here's an example. Function takes parameter x and returns value y. Fine, makes sense. We kind of understand what's going on, but it's a little dry. So here's another example. Function can be used to return the number of y based on x. It's pretty similar, but it's starting to kind of maybe throw in what you're going to do with it. Like, this is just explanation, and this might be auto-generated maybe. That's fine. This is maybe a bit more human. And as these are kind of slightly sort of dumbed down examples, this may not always be completely clear as to, you know, why do you need that extra text? But as you start to get into more complex terms, this might make a bit more sense. So this is fine, but this is using something, an example of what is called the passive voice. Now, there's nothing wrong with the passive voice, and British English especially has a term called passive-aggressive, because British people love to dodge issues and try to make it seem like, oh, no, not really. And the problem with passive voice is it can come across as a bit cold or a bit withdrawn or like you're not really involved with something. And the arguments over whether this is applicable or not in technical documentation can go back and forth, but you're listening to me, so I'm going to give you my opinion. Here's another example. This is using what is called the active voice. You can use function to return the value of y based on x. There's some tiny changes. It still kind of says the same thing, but it's sort of telling the person who's reading, you can do this. Off you go. You use this to do something. And whether you use you or we, doesn't really matter. Again, it's a style guide thing. Pick one and stick to it. Otherwise, that gets even more confusing. But I personally tend to prefer you. So with this switch, we're involving the reader, and we make them feel a little bit more involved in the explanation. I know, again, I've got a room full of developers here. This seems odd. Like, what difference does it make? But as I was saying earlier, every little thing like this you do makes it slightly easier to understand, slightly less overload for someone to understand. And all these little things added up start to make the documentation feel more understandable. And we'll come to that in a minute, actually, of what that really means in the long run. So as I say, this is an example of a passive versus active. I'm going to give you a non-technical example to maybe make this make some more sense. So say you apply to your HR or people or human resources department for holiday, and you get this response back. Holiday approval will be notified in due course. Doesn't sound very friendly, does it? What does that mean? And so if we put this into a more friendly way, we will notify you about holiday approval in due course. At least we know who's going to do it now. And so I've picked a more human example here because you start to understand now what I mean. So when you are using the passive voice in technical explanation, often it can kind of be like, well, what's doing this? Who's doing that? Am I doing it? Is the program doing it? Is the framework doing it? Like, who's doing this? So it's about identifying the actor and the subject. And granted, there are many cases where this isn't appropriate. Distributed systems, for example, where you're really actually not sure who's going to be the actor and the subject because there's lots of things going on. So there are definitely many edge cases where this doesn't work. But in many cases, it can work quite well. All right. And I'm building towards why this is all kind of useful. Next one is keep it short. I'm not going to say keep it simple, because this is technical documentation, so keeping it simple is not always an option, but keep it short. One of the things I often do, much to the disappointment of my non-native English speakers, is take all this wonderful language they've written and cut it all out. And then they get very upset. But half the time, there's a lot of things you do not need. English is many things, but one of the things it is there's a lot of stuff in English you do not need. You can get rid of a lot of it and still have exactly the same meaning. And again, bear in mind we're often writing for other non-native speakers. There's a lot less for them to read through as well. There's a lot less to wade through to get to the important parts. And again, this can involve things like repetition, just extraneous words you don't need, etc., etc. And this comes back a little bit to what I said earlier, is that if you understand what you're writing about very, very well, then you can be concise and short more easily. There's a great quote on this that no one really knows who said, because actually writing short and concise is hard. It's very easy to write just verbosely and type away. Writing short, cutting something down from 1,200 words to 600 words, that is hard. I am not going to lie about it. So it is hard. And then we have things like weasel words. These are some of the things you can get rid of. Not a comprehensive not a comprehensive list, but you'll get the idea here. These are basically words that don't really mean anything, or at worst, can be patronizing. You've probably seen some of these. So, conversational English, fine. Written English, technical English, you don't need it. It doesn't mean anything. Simply, easily, just. These are horrible words. Do not use them. If you tell someone, simply do this, and they get stuck, they think they're an idiot. That's not good. Just do this. No, nothing is ever that simple. We know this. Very, again, it's a word, doesn't really add anything in technical explanation. In order to is my favorite one from my German-speaking colleagues, because German is much more verbose than English, and they often will put these things in that you could just say to quite often. Not always, but quite often. Now, bizarrely, I'm going to give a quote here from someone who is a fiction writer to explain why all this is kind of useful. He's talking specifically here about adverbs, which is something else, but we can replace this with weasel words and all sorts of things. It's a quote from Stephen King, from his wonderful book on writing. Even if you're not intending to write fiction, even if you don't like Stephen King, like his books are bloody long, so he's quite hypocritical in his own way, but his sentences are very short. A lot of this is about confidence. And why is confidence important in technical documentation? Because someone is reading about your project because they want to be told how to use it. And if your writing doesn't seem very confident and is a little vague and unclear, people are not necessarily sure if what they're reading is correct or not. And this is some of the reasons we want to remove some of these things to make the writing much more confident. And there are often reasons that, especially in technical writing, we do this. And this is maybe one of my more controversial statements if I was giving this to a tech writers audience, because often we're doing it on purpose. We don't want to be sued. We don't want to get taken, have SLAs violated because we said something was this in the documentation and it wasn't. And actually, in this same book, he's quite critical of tech writers. But this book was written about 15 years ago, so maybe things have changed a bit. And confidence, making your writing confident, is going to take some work. If you're going to write down very clearly in active voice with no weasel words to say, this is how you do something, you've got to be damn sure that is how you do something and that it works. So this will take time, but in the long run, of course, it means that people will read something, they follow it, and not only is it kind of easy to understand, it does work. So yes, it will take time, and it will take some rethinking, but it's worth it, hopefully, in the long run. All right, grammar lesson over. Let's have a look at some other things. So documentation these days is on the web. It doesn't actually have to just be words, and in fact, some of the better ways to do things are without words. We have interactive consoles, things like JS Fiddle, and videos, animated GIFs, a whole bunch of things. And videos especially are popular with younger developers, and I use the term younger to mean new and maybe younger in age. They're not necessarily the same thing. Videos are quite hard to make, though. They are time-consuming and harder to edit and keep up to date, but do at least consider them. But so annotated images, this is from the Docker documentation for their I'm not sure if, I think replace was a note to myself that I forgot to do. So there we go, behind the curtain there. This is an example of using images to show how to use the Docker for Mac, for example. Now, images also have a problem is they get out of date, especially with an application that has a GUI, things change. Again, there are ways to automate this. I'm happy to talk to talk infinitely about automating things at a later date because I'm rapidly running out of time. But images are one way. Then we have these cool things like interactive consoles. This was a database company I worked for. We created a fake JavaScript console in the documentation where people can run a query and see what it does. And you've got like a fake, well, not a fake server, you've got a real server running in the background that's processing this. This sort of stuff works really, really well in developer documentation, but does require some setup. Things like people will probably try to break it. You will need to reset the environment periodically and things like that. So there are some pitfalls to be wary of, but that can work very, very well, especially with applications that are hard to visualize what it's going to look like. You're probably also familiar with things like JS Fiddles, and there's a CodePen, and there's a whole bunch of examples like this, where you have an example in embedded, and you can go externally or internally, play with it, experiment with it, etc. And this kind of handles a lot of the environment for you, but it's mostly web languages. Compiled languages and things like that can be harder, but it is possible these days. In fact, more possible than it ever used to be. So, and these are effective too. And then even a lot of API rendering applications even have inbuilt things. So this is an example from API Blueprint and Apiary, which is now a service owned by Oracle, so whether you want to use it or not is a whole other thing. But you can test and play with the API. And again, you need to have something to handle this, and often with the commercial services they'll do it for you, but it lets people play with it in place and experiment and understand things. So these are some other things you can do. And like Umbraco does, even having something you download from the documentation that is commented and relevant to them, and they can kind of play with alongside the documentation is also a really cool way. There's a company called Pusher, which is a messaging bus that does this really nicely as well. In the documentation, they tell you to do something, you run something in your terminal, and the page and the terminal are talking to each other. And that's a really nice way that developers are going, ah, cool, I get this, I see what's going on. And it's a simple example, but it works really nicely. Great, so we've talked about all the great things that can go into good documentation. How do we make it? This is going to be quite brief because tech writers, like developers, have 101 tools we argue about which are superior and which are inferior, but it all really depends. But the main thing I want to get into here is most of them you're probably using already. It's the nice thing about technical documentation. There are different types of formats. There are things like topic-based documentation. These tend to be often more proprietary formats, usually XML-based formats. You'll often need custom tooling to use them. They tend to be in the more enterprise and older world documentation. Someone will probably shoot me down for saying that, but that's my experience. And often they come with a whole suite of commercial tooling. This is actually one of the commercial things that Adobe offers that you may not even be aware of. But the advantages of them is they are very good for collaborative work. They are very good for creating, for single sourcing. So in the days when you used to produce manuals, help systems, and a web page, for example, things like that, which is not so relevant these days, but it's what they were kind of built to be there for. The interesting thing with these is you often break the documentation down into topics. You cover a topic as opposed to kind of a narrative. And this is good because it's easy to maintain, but it's not necessarily always the easiest way to read because often the topics are assembled in kind of a more knowledge management way than a human way. And this is sort of what I could see that the Umbraco docs, how they're organized, even though they're not using these formats. It's kind of chunked into topics as opposed to kind of entire workflows, a lot of the time, not all the time. And then we have what is being loosely called by my community docs as code, but you'll probably just know as markup languages. And I've always worked in startups and new tech companies, and it's always been the way I've done things. So it's sort of strange to me. And these are formats like Markdown, which you probably know very well because Umbraco uses it. Markdown is great, it's simple, it's very easy for people to use, but it has its limitations, especially as your documentation gets more complicated and maybe you want to write something once and use it in different places, or maybe you want to use partials, maybe you want to use variables, all sorts of things like that. Markdown hits a barrier. And the other problem with Markdown is there's no standard. The common mark standard is kind of the standard, but it's not really. And it's also very, very limited. And there are various flavors of Markdown that will add things that documentation users find useful. So for example, bits of the Umbraco documentation is using a Microsoft tool called DocFX, which it's quite a nice tool. It's mostly aimed at C# code bases, but you can even ignore the C# stuff, and its flavor of Markdown has some really nice features, like being able to have code tabs for examples and things like that. So, and then MKDocs, which is made by somebody, also does some similar things. It's Markdown plus some extra stuff. This is the interesting thing with Markdown. But then Restructured Text and ASCII doc. Restructured Text, if you've ever done any work in Python, you will probably know it. It adds a lot of this functionality, but my God, is the syntax confusing. I've been using it for over a year on a project, and I still can't remember how to make a link. And the tooling for it in text editors is not so much supported. But if you want to do more complex things, it's a good option. ASCII doc tries to sit somewhere in the middle and be kind of as user-friendly as Markdown, but add the features of restructured text. And it's a very nice community, a very friendly community. But again, whilst the community maintains very good tooling for it, it's not widely supported yet. It's sort of gaining popularity. So it could be one to think about. The thing to bear in mind with all of these, especially in an open source project, is a lot of people might make their contribution by going directly to GitHub or GitLab or something like that. So it would be good if the editor supports the format you're using, which is unfortunately mostly Markdown. So it limits you a little bit. Then we have specs. These are mostly API things. You've probably encountered some of these. The Open API spec, formerly known as Swagger, is probably the most popular. This is ways of documenting an API. Depending on your workflow, maybe you document the API first, then it goes to developers. Maybe the code generates the spec. Maybe the writer writes the spec, or maybe the developers write the spec. It really depends on the company. And this is what will often feed your reference documentation and give you maybe some of those interactive experiences I showed you earlier. Open API has quite a nice suite of tools you can use. API Blueprint was the example you saw, which is the now Oracle-owned company. Postman is a very nice testing tool that does generate documentation, and you can import and export other formats, but it doesn't really do much in addition to the API documentation. So it's hard to kind of do much else apart from just generate the docs. And then there's things like Doxygen and all these sort of documentation that can be generated from the code base as well in a similar way. And again, who writes that is somewhat up to you. But this is getting into the kind of reference areas of documentation. So, you know, the writing doesn't have to be quite so ticking a lot of those boxes I've already mentioned. Then we have things like management and rendering. There's many, many ways of doing this. It's really up to you. If you're in the C# world, I say there is DocFX, which is pretty good. It's maintained by Microsoft. Its development is a little up and down. They've been talking about a version 3 for quite some time. I don't know when it's coming, but in the meantime, it's perfectly decent. But there's many, many others. MKDocs is a popular one at the moment. Read the Docs, which is popular in the Sphinx community. There's many, many. You pick the one that works best for your requirements. A lot of people say to me, what's the best? So, well, what do you want to do? Management, you're probably going to be using version control as well. Probably doesn't surprise you here. And how you manage it in the same repository and a separate repository, again, is up to you. There is no best way. Umbraco has it separate. Many projects keep it together. It kind of really depends on how you roll out features. Now I'm going to get to my favorite topic with very little time to talk about it. And I have entire talks on this. So testing, linting, automating. So I have mentioned a whole bunch of things here, and you're thinking, Chris, you give me a lot of work to do. I don't like this. I like what you're talking about, but I haven't got time for this. Thankfully, there's a lot of stuff to help you here. We're talking, the advantage of using things like Markdown and Restructured Text is they are markup formats. They are very easy to integrate into CI tools, into text editors, and all sorts of things. I'm going to show you one of my favorite tools. Come out. It's always a pain when you want to come out of... No? Where are you? It's here somewhere. There we go. Okay. So I've dived into the Umbraco docs here. Got to find my mouse, of course. Where is it? There it is. Right. So this is Visual Studio Code. You probably know it well. You can see I've got lots of underlines here. This is linting English language. This is one of my favorite tools, and there are other options are available, but it's my favorite, so I'm going to talk about it. And the person who develops it is really, really friendly. So this lets you define a lot of these style rules that I've mentioned and say, okay, we want to not use passive voice, we want to use this spelling of our product name with this capitalization instead of this, etc., etc. And there's a whole library of styles you can draw upon. Like the community has codified the Microsoft style guide, the IBM style guide, the Google style guide, which includes a lot of these things I've mentioned. And right inside I'm guessing as coders have used linting, you're familiar with the concepts of linting, like a recommendation more than a something is wrong. So this one is showing me, for example, that it suggested we should have sentences less than 25 words. Let's find another one. This is telling me that frequently may not be the easiest term to use. This is telling me, of course, that Umbraco is a spelling error because it's not a real word, but we could add it to our own personal dictionary and then it wouldn't highlight it anymore. And lots of examples here. And this can also hook up to continuous integration and things like that too. Whether you decide that if the level of errors goes above a certain amount breaks a build or not, it's up to you. Maybe you break it on spelling errors, but not grammar errors. You know, it's kind of up to you how you want to do it. So I use this tool all the time. It also sits down in the, if I can see it from here, it also sits down in the Visual Studio Code like status bar here. You can see all the different ons. I'm not sure what that is, but and then I've also got like markdown things as well and some other things. But you can see a whole bunch of suggestions that I might want to look into. So a lot of what I've mentioned is available to put into Visual Studio Code, Atom, Sublime, Vi. I'm not sure about Emacs, sorry. But I'm guessing as C# developers, you're probably have this on your machine anyway. So, and we've already created a lot of the styles that you can follow and use. So you don't have to do too much work because you've even got some tools here that are going to help you do it, which is pretty cool. I also mentioned testing the code as well. Depending on the platform you use, like Restructured Text, for example, lets you actually test the code by default. Markdown, maybe not. So how you do that is, it little depends on the language you're using, but there are ways to maybe keep the way I tend to find works best is you keep the application actually in a separate repository or in the same repository but separate. So it's a full application that can be tested, and then you embed the lines of code in the documentation. So they live slightly separately and are assembled at merge, but you can test the code as well. And there's so many more things you can do. You can generate screenshots automatically. There's a wonderful Python tool called Robots that lets you generate screenshots with annotations as well. So every time you build, you are getting up-to-date screenshots without even having to create them. You can even start to do this with a lot of the terminal screen captures. The most commonly known one is Askinamar, but there's actually plenty of others where you could automatically generate like animated code terminals as you go. And this is a subject that I do actually have entire talks on, and I've just got one slide. So there's a lot you can do, and I am happy to kind of show you many examples of this because it's something I really love experimenting with. But I am now going to stop talking and wrap up. If you want to know some more, this is a link to a blog post I wrote some time ago that is kind of the origins of this presentation. The presentation has changed a bit, but if you want something to read, the kind of community I'm a member of that is very friendly to anybody who wants to be passionate about writing better documentation is the Write the Docs kind of community. We're actually having the American conference in Portland right now, but there are European ones. There's now one in Lithuania, which is coming up in June, very soon, and there's one in Prague that's in September. But in the meantime, there's a Slack channel you can join too. I have some, even has some stickers if you want to put them on your laptop. It's a very, very nice community to go and talk to people about things. And finally, why do all this? The other thing I will say is documentation isn't just for developers. If you write good documentation, you actually get better things like search results and marketing and business people making decisions about a product that maybe you as a developer love, but the person who pays the checks kind of wants to see if they think it's worth it. And if they can read some documentation and even kind of get a rough idea of what it's about, they're kind of more likely to be on your side as well. So just remember that it isn't just for people who understand code. It can help in many, many other ways. And that was me. This is where you can find me. I also have my own stickers. The little chinchilla, which is a nickname I've had for a very long time for reasons that are not very interesting, but it's a cool little logo. And I'm not entirely sure if we're going straight to lunch or have time for questions. So I don't know, we'll see.
And we do have time for questions.
Cool.
So if anybody has any questions, I can run the mic around. Going once, going twice.
I think I've just overwhelmed you all, so I'm happy to join.
And to my knowledge, too, you'll be around for lunch and
yeah, for lunch, and I've got a few calls this afternoon, but I'll be around a bit tomorrow as well. So.
Perfect.
Or you can always tweet at me or send me an email. I'm happy to talk about this stuff endlessly.
Great. Well, with that then, we do the next session, so to speak, is lunch, and that starts at 12:30 in I think just about 10 minutes. So why don't we give one last thank you and round of applause for Chris. It was greatly appreciated.